Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Laura Moody, founding partner of Purpose Possible. And on behalf of everyone on our team, welcome to the first 100 days and beyond. Since late January, I have led the firm's Government Affairs Task Force. This group was formed in response to just the fast pace of news coming out of Washington related to federal funding. We heard from our clients and our consultants that they were just overwhelmed. They didn't know how to cut through the noise to focus on what was really important to nonprofits. So our task force began producing a weekly digest of information to do just that. Now that we've reached the 100-day mark, it was time to reflect on what has happened, what we've learned, and to have a conversation about what comes next. That's why we're all here today. And we encourage each of you to submit questions in the feed that you're watching. Our team on the back end can see them in real time, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Now on to introductions. Maryland Delegate Janelle Wilkins proudly represents the 20th Legislative District in the Maryland House of Delegates. Born in Kingston, Jamaica, she is dedicated to policy change that makes a difference in people's lives. Delegate Wilkins is the vice chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, where she also chairs the subcommittee on election law. Delegate Wilkins is the chair of the Legislative Black Caucus of Maryland, the largest Black caucus in the nation. And as if that didn't keep her busy enough, she also works as the Director of State and Local Government Affairs at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, the nation's oldest and largest civil rights coalition. Senator Josh McLaurin, a Democrat, he notes, was elected to the Georgia State Senate in 2022. He serves Georgia's 14th district, which covers portions of North Fulton County. Previously, he served 4 years in the Georgia House of Representatives. Senator McLaurin grew up in Cobb County, is a double dog graduate of UGA, and received his law degree from Yale. His law practice has focused primarily on business litigation and aviation law. Senator McLaurin serves as Secretary of the Senate Committee on Veterans, Military, and Homeland Security, and is a member of the Senate Committees on Economic Development and Tourism, Retirement, and Transportation. Susanna Darrow, founding partner of Purpose Possible, has worked with mission-based organizations across the Southeast for over 15 years to support organizational strategy, program development, and fundraising. Susanna is chair-elect of the board of directors for the Atlanta chapter of the Association of Fundraising Professionals and serves on the boards of the Kiwanis Club of Atlanta, Create ATL, and the University of Georgia Lamar Dodd School of Art. Since 2017, Susanna has worked with council member Amir Faroqi as the Arts and Culture Advisor for Atlanta City Council District 2. Now, to give us all some context and to sort of set the stage for our conversation, I wanted to share some data collected by the Urban Institute. This information just conveys the scale of federal dollars awarded to nonprofits across the country and by state. This data is from 2021, by the way. Across the U.S., nonprofits received a total of $267 billion in government grants. That's a lot of money. And we want to talk about I will tell you how much was also allocated to each of your states. In Georgia, 2,130 nonprofits received a total of $5.2 billion in government grants. And the subsectors receiving the most federal dollars are health, human services, international affairs, and arts and education. In Maryland, 2,487 nonprofits received a total of $6.1 billion in government grants. The subsectors receiving the most federal dollars were arts and culture, human services, and those classified as religion-related and public or societal benefit. So, delegate and senator, hearing those figures and what subsectors would be at most risk should federal dollars be withdrawn, what are each of your just greatest concerns for your constituents and the well-beings of your state overall? And do you believe your legislators grasp the significance of these numbers? I'm thinking about job losses within the sector, but also the community impact.
I think that's a great question, a great opening, and it's something that we're absolutely thinking about, especially for us in Maryland. We're actually we dealt with a huge shortfall this legislative session. Our session is 90 days, and we're now at 100 days of the Trump administration. So for pretty much the entirety of our legislative session, we were dealing with the impacts, whether it was the funding freeze that took place, that was utter confusion on if funds are frozen or not frozen. Or right before we adjourned, we found out that we lost $400 million because the Trump administration decided that they were no longer going to follow through on their promise to allow certain states to spend down their education dollars from COVID. And so there are just all of these sort of catching us off guard fiscal impacts that took place. And for us, on top of that, we were dealing with a shortfall in our budget of $3 billion. So when I saw that $6 billion that you just put up on the screen, that's what immediately came to mind, that we just closed a shortfall. We closed by balancing out our budget. We actually had a small increase actually in revenue by the time we finished. And so the $6.1 billion, when I think about the state and the financial challenges and the impacts they were already seeing, it's definitely something that is on our mind, and it would be just a huge gap for us to fill.
Thanks, Laura, and good to see you, Delegate, and Susanna. I am honored to be here. Josh McLaurin, as you said, Georgia State Senate, and I'm in the minority party. So I told the delegate before we started this presentation, I'm envious of the authority or the influence that her party and her caucus has in Maryland. So in Georgia, the minority party has the additional setback in addition to having to respond to the moment, which is hard for everybody across the country. We're also coming at it from a standpoint of having ideological disagreements with the majority and having to sort of convince the majority or state officials on the agency side that this is as big of a crisis as it is. Now, a lot of them know that it is because it's their budgets, it's their constituents that are getting hit, but the politics of it are such that they have a harder time acknowledging the shortfall or the deficit because part of the politics or the atmosphere in Georgia is they've got to pretend that everything is hunky-dory. And so it was my caucus in the Senate that ended up doing a lot of the voicing of the alarm from the Senate floor. At least we get these little speeches we can give called points of personal privilege, where we sort of talk about anything for 5 minutes, which is kind of dangerous. But you can use your powers for good, right? And talk about some of these shortfalls. We had, as an example, when USAID was dismantled, it seems like illegally, there was a nonprofit called MANA in Georgia that made something called RTUF, ready to use therapeutic food. And this was life-saving nutritional peanut mix, basically, for kids around the globe. I mean, serving countless children who have nutrition needs and hunger issues everywhere. And so I think there were millions of dollars worth of contracts that this nonprofit had to serve a large child population across the globe, and that money was cut. There was reporting at the beginning of some of the cuts where the nonprofit said there's uncertainty, we don't know what's going to happen, and ultimately we find out that those contracts are basically terminated. So there's the humanitarian, empathetic angle, which is we care about what happens to children across the globe, but there's also the local economic impact, which is these are Georgia peanut farmers that are losing out on a reliable buyer of their goods. And so, it's relative to the state budget. If you've got roughly $40 billion in state funds and a roughly similar equivalent in federal funds as pass through, somewhere between, 70, $80 billion in spend, a shortfall of $5 billion of direct aid to Georgia nonprofits represents, just like the delegate said, a massive hole in the direct spending that we are putting into the sector and putting into the welfare of our constituents.
Knowing that federal dollars are at best an unstable source of funding for the next few years. It would seem that the nonprofit sector must make its case to local and state governments to demonstrate the value of the sector and the services nonprofits provide to their local communities. What are some of the key policy areas related to the nonprofit sector that each of you anticipate will be addressed in future legislative sessions? That could be, like you mentioned, hunger, agriculture, any specific sort of topic area that you feel might be more amenable to being addressed by your upcoming sessions.
I think that we're looking to fill holes in areas where we are seeing and hearing from our constituents the most. For example, in my community, it has a lot to do with housing. Housing insecurity, housing affordability. In Maryland, we are heavily impacted by the federal job layoffs. That is a huge area and major sector for us, whether it's in our income taxes, but also just the well-being of our residents to be able to be gainfully employed. So employment services that are provided, various safety net services, as well as issues dealing with helping people to navigate, whether it's healthcare or other types of benefits. So those sorts of human services, safety net types of programs will be really important to us. And we really prioritize things that deal with the job market and providing those kinds of resources, because that's a huge impact for us in the state of Maryland.
Hard to predict exactly what the majority in Georgia will focus on if there are real problems with federal funding getting to Georgia based on some of the uncertainty and chaos. I will say I know that veterans issues are a big bipartisan priority in Georgia. And as you mentioned, I sit on the Veterans Committee in the Senate. And one of the things that comes up a lot is dissatisfaction with the VA at its current level of funding and staffing, right? And that's a years-long problem. And veterans who are either applying for benefits and have to make use of nonprofit or free services to apply for benefits, that's a big issue that comes up. But just in general, veterans' mental health care and housing. We had a study committee in the Senate on those issues, and we encompassed a wide range of issues. Again, already with the current system at its current levels of funding and staffing. So I think one thing we might see if some government agency services break down, direct services that are funded the traditional way, is nonprofits coming to the Capitol and saying, look, here's the population we thought we were serving, and now it's doubled or tripled, and the demand is increased, and we are crisis levels, and so that pitch becomes even louder, and I think too that it just makes plain the chaos and the uncertainty on the government agency side, the way that nonprofits end up having to respond. I mean, the VA I think had something like 80,000 cuts under the current DOGE program or platform. I don't even know what to call it exactly. But it is going to cause these downstream effects that we may not see immediately, but it may be in a year's time, 2 years' time, all of a sudden there's a surge of need that our current levels of nonprofit funding are not even able to address.
And I'll add on. Oh, I'm sorry. You go and I add on. Okay. I just wanted to add on, Senator. You gave me a thought when you mentioned, coming to you and sharing. I would advise any nonprofit that is listening to us that this is the time to make sure that your legislator recalls the amazing work that you're doing in the community, especially if you are facing our constituents, supporting our constituents, providing that direct support. That for me, we are adjourned. We're bombarded with a million things now as we're still facing the impacts of the federal government. And now is the time to kind of reach out, have us drop in or drop by our offices to make sure that you're at top of mind around the important services that you're providing in the community. So I just wanted to add that as a direct point for the nonprofits that are listening in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is such an important piece because I think, Senator McLaurin, you started touching on this, which is, the social safety net organizations are the ones that I think we are particularly concerned about, not because we're concerned that their direct funding is going to be cut necessarily, but I think they are going to feel the downstream effects of so many of the other cuts that are coming up across so many other sectors that are happening right now. And so really their anticipation of what the surge in community need is going to look like, I think is a real concern. And particularly thinking about future legislation that's going forward, I think another thing we're really looking to right now is that a lot of the cuts that have occurred in the first 100 days, that is coming in on 2025 funding, which was already allocated, which is why I think some of the halts have been able to be prevented, or at least there are mechanisms in place to try to adjust for those. I think from the sector standpoint, something that we're really concerned about is going into May and the budgeting for next year, how much more cuts are going to happen, because it's sort of fresh on the chopping block, and it's not something that can be sort of, because of retroactive management, can be hopefully halted or at least delayed. So that's, I think, going to be a huge concern. But on sort of a more optimistic note, I think sort of the mention of the peanut farmers for Georgia, I think that's a really good example of where people in Fitzgerald, which was primarily implicated in that, did a great job of going to their elected officials and really making such a strong case for the impact on their workforce, the economic impacts for their city, and were able to really, I think, make some really strong cases for that have ultimately helped them to get some of that funding back online and some things sort of back in order there. So I do think that's actually a great case study to look at in terms of how nonprofits, how communities can really come together to hopefully make the case for the importance of their continued operations, even, when they may be in states or communities that the politics is not necessarily on their side for that. So.
Well, and I'll throw out a little idea, and I know we're going to talk more about this and sort of trying to prepare people today for how to engage the politics or the advocacy piece to maintain continuity of operations and funding. But you can almost think about political relationships and diversity of political relationships as a safety net unto itself, right? Just the same way that we have layers of nonprofit organizations and advocacy groups that are available to, catch people when they're falling. We need to be thinking about each organization's relationships in the same way, to be networked, not just in one way. If you know one legislator at the Capitol is very powerful and you think, oh, I'm fine because that legislator's got my back and they'll always stop the bad thing. Well, what if they don't? What if there's some reason they're absent that day? They can't advocate on your behalf. The vote goes the wrong way. If you don't have the layers of relationships, not just with one legislator, with a bunch of legislators, not just at the state level, at the local level, right. I think it's just good preventative hygiene to, as the delegate said, always be making your case, even in times of plenty, for why you're so important and an important part of the community.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great point. And something that we've been talking about internally and with our clients is, we can't only talk to our representatives and legislators who we agree with all the time. This concerted effort to really reach across the aisle to talk to, everyone across the political spectrum is more vital than ever. Not just for the advocacy piece, but also, just to help sort of break down some of the silos that have been created over the last few years. Would either of you speak to, any examples of bipartisanship that might have either recently occurred or occur in the near future related to nonprofits and the work that they do in your states?
Well, I'll say this, point of pride about being in the minority party is, it's like swinging 3 bats when you warm up for baseball, or running with an extra vest on, so that a little extra resistance training, right? Because you don't have the ability quite as much to press a button and do things. Not that that's super easy in the majority either, but you do have to find a way to speak to the majority party in a language that they understand and appreciate. So I'll take an example from my service in the Senate. There was a member of the majority party who was the chairman of a committee that dealt with elections issues and voting issues. And I approached him about an issue relating to felony disenfranchisement. So if you're aware, after the Civil War, many states, not just Southern states, enacted a broad range of felonies in order to disenfranchise newly enfranchised Black people, right? During the sort of Reconstruction era. So there was a backlash to Black people getting voting rights. And this has caused 150 years of regressive policy that has spread and impacted so many people. In Georgia, we have the largest probation population. When you're under an active felony sentence, you can't vote in the state of Georgia. So that some people are out probation, parole, kind of living normal lives in the community, in some cases their whole life. And so they're essentially walking around with no voting rights. So this is an issue that you might not imagine that the majority party in my state would be super keen to pick up. But I approached this legislator multiple times. I tried not to hound him, try not to overdo it, but we maybe had 3 or 4 good conversations about it over the first 2 years. And he said, you know what, I'll give you a hearing, right? And so we had a hearing, and people who were directly affected came in. And they told their stories. They talked about paying taxes and how, for all intents and purposes, they're members of the community and people don't even know that they're under an active sentence. They're raising kids, et cetera. And then that hearing mattered to that legislator. And he said, well, why don't we do a study committee? And so we passed a study committee just this session, my 3rd session in the Senate, that looks at the issue and looks at least post-incarceration when people are back out in communities. Should we consider amending the Georgia Constitution and the relevant statutes to give folks a path to having their voting rights restored, even though they're under an active probation or parole sentence? And so if I had walked up to this guy in 2023 in January and said, hey, let's do a study committee, he'd be like, I don't know, no thanks, thanks, but no thanks. But I did an incremental sort of advocacy effort that was just one conversation at a time. And he's, I think, he might even consider himself kind of an unlikely champion of this issue, but he just came around. And not every story is going to be take your most progressive issue and talk to your most conservative legislator, and in 3 years' time, it all works out. But I think there's something to be said for, to your point, Laura, never count somebody out. Don't think just because of this person's background, for all you know, they've got a family member, a cousin who's directly impacted by the issue that you are working on. And it may be that they have a personal story that they can access emotionally. And so I think politics is the art of the possible. And it's just realizing that sometimes there are really unlikely and inspirational pathways to getting what you want that you never would have expected.
I'll just jump in really quickly. I really like this example too, because I think in nonprofits, especially when we think about fundraising examples, when we're working with a new donor, a new partnership, that's an 18-month runway to really get to a yes or even a first ask a lot of times. And I think this is such a good sort of similarity there, that it's just a reminder that at the end of the day, these are all relationships that have to be cultivated and built. And it's not just going to somebody the first time as soon as there's a problem or as soon as you need something immediately. It's having that kind of gradual and progressive connection to these individuals. So thank you for sharing that.
And Delegate Wilkins, any sort of bipartisan nonprofit issue examples you'd like to share?
Yes. So in Maryland, we do have a Democratic House, Senate, and governor. However, we work a lot in a bipartisan manner. In my committee, several of the issue jurisdiction areas. So we have education, we have taxes, we have gaming, and we have election law. Education in particular tends to be a very bipartisan issue in committee, where we all come together around the issue in many different topics. One of those this legislative session was about phones in schools, and that ended up being a really big issue in the session, where Democrats and Republicans came together around the table to figure out how to best work on this and support our locals in making sure that our students' wellness were priority, while also balancing this issue of phones in schools. Election law, which is what I chair, definitely tends to be more of a lightning rod issue. But Senator, what you just shared was music to my ears, because that's an issue that I lead on in the Maryland General Assembly that we should talk more about, and actually introduce the bill on automatic voter registration for those who have finished their term of confinement in Maryland. So those are some of the issues when it comes to taxes, which was also a big topic this session. That's another one that is not as bipartisan. But when we look at the votes on the House floor, the majority of the times we're voting in a bipartisan manner. And I share that to add to the conversation around, even in a state where, quite frankly, we have the numbers in Maryland to vote out any bill or any issue. We see a lot of bipartisanship with helping to improve pieces of legislation, with making sure that, because we do visits to our different communities across the state, and sometimes we visit more Republican areas. My committee went to Allegheny County in Western Maryland during the interim. And so it happens to be the area that the minority leader represents, and seeing his community, getting to interact. And so when we're in session and he's talking about the needs of his community, there's a lot more work and investment to make sure that his community is seen, is heard, and is getting their needs met. So I think, and sometimes we do visit various nonprofits, we visit schools, we do some of those site visits as a committee during the interim. So I would also add that, to the extent that there are relationships and building relationships with committee chairs and committee leaders, that when those site visits are happening, that you put the bug in the ear that, hey, we have this really amazing program, we have this great work that is going, you're building that relationship, as Susanna said, so that perhaps when we do these types of visits in the interim, that your nonprofit is a part of that, and that the entire committee in a bipartisan manner gets to interact and kind of build that investment as well.
So, Delegate and Senator, you've both mentioned getting to know nonprofits, wanting to hear from nonprofits in your district. So, for the benefit of our clients and our listeners, how do you wish to learn about the work of nonprofits in your districts, and what do you need from them in order to be able to advocate on their behalf to your peers? Like, what are the tangibles that you need and want?
That's a great question. Let's sort of like hack the animal brain of a legislator for a second and talk about, what gets our attention. The word constituent always gets our attention, right? And so I think not even just a nonprofit that's operating in the district. Go get a client who's willing to come do advocacy, if they're open to that, who is a constituent, so they can tell a personal story. Not much can break through partisan. If a vote is iced before the committee even walks in a room, and there's power politics at play, there's very little that can disrupt that type of dynamic in a state legislature. A personal story is one of those things. I have seen committee rooms melt when somebody walks in and tells a compelling personal story that involves a lot of vulnerability and courage and overcoming odds. You will see people of any party respond in a really human way to that if done correctly. The same thing goes for a one-on-one constituent interaction. So a personal story by a constituent, I think, is always a great start. Another thing is crisis. I hate to say it, but if you're experiencing a lot of hardship, and obviously we're sending the message today, don't wait for that to have a relationship and a conversation. But if you are experiencing a shortage or a certain level of crisis that you think needs attention, that's the sort of thing that feeds political messaging. A representative, senator, delegate can say, look at what's happening in my district. They may want to tie it to national politics for their own purposes, but the bottom line is you've found a reason why they're motivated to speak out on your issue. And those are probably the first two things I can think of. I would defer to the delegate who can press a couple more buttons than me about what gets her office moving.
I think that's exactly right. I think the saying, don't tell me, show me, really applies here. I really benefit from being able to see the work in action. So, for example, there are a lot of groups that do food distribution and do those sorts of safety net direct service types of programs. So, I've been invited to a number of food distributions to help hand out food, interact with constituents and residents, and see the work in action. Other places that provide after school programming or some of the childcare for our low income communities that have invited me to be there and see the cute kids, that always helps. And so really seeing the work of the organization in action, I think is really important. And the constituent piece cannot be emphasized enough. However, you can get us in front of our constituents, whether we're in our districts or at the state capitals, to hear the stories and the impact. Those types of things really leave a mark on our minds and help us to advocate. And I do want to lift up what Susanna said, because that really rang true for me. I have had groups that I hadn't interacted with before that are doing amazing work, but I meet them and it's like, we need money for this, or that. And I think slowing down and building that relationship is really important, and getting the buy-in of not just myself, but here in Maryland, we really operate very much by counties. So, and I represent Montgomery County. So helping to build the relationships, not just with myself, but with other members of my delegation from Montgomery County, so you really come in stronger, as opposed to kind of, oh, it's great to meet you. We really need funding for XYZ. Really working to build that long-term relationship, I do think, is much more effective, so that we can really advocate and be just a strong voice when it's time for the budget decisions.
Can I add one more thing? The delegate reminded me about how to approach, because there's this paradox, right? If you start early before there's a crisis and you start building a relationship, maybe there's not a whole lot that's going to be attention grabbing about your pitch, but you can't wait until there's a crisis to make a first pitch or ask. So one idea that I just thought of, there's several contract lobbyists in Georgia. It's a bad word for a lot of people who don't work directly in the capital, the word lobbyist, but there are a lot of contract lobbyists who do primarily nonprofit causes and may have several clients who work in justice spaces, and those contract lobbyists, the benefit of hiring one, hopefully at some kind of a non-corporate rate, right, that's affordable, especially in a time where budgets are crunched. But the benefit is that they have pre-existing relationships with legislators that they have been working on for 20, 30 years in some cases. And so if you're looking for a way to quick start that relationship, to get a dinner together, or a happy hour where you can get some direct FaceTime with a couple key representatives, that is one way to think about. I mean, even if it's a one-off, hey, let's plan an event so we can do a meet and greet, you can get to know us. That's relationship capital that's already there, and that's how they do their jobs.
I have a question. Maybe I'm going to request for some additional foundational clarification, because I think this is something that we talk about with our clients a bit. Is I think for a lot of nonprofits, one thing that we've seen, especially at this moment, where the need for better relationships with elected officials, with representatives, is now so much more apparent than it has ever been, probably, is that a lot of our nonprofits that we work with, I think, are really hesitant and uncertain as to what they are allowed to do within their, within their 501c3 status. I think there tends to be a lot of kind of confusing language around that. And I think one thing that we've tried to reiterate is you are absolutely allowed to have a connection to these elected officials. No, you cannot campaign for them, and no, you cannot, have very heavily partisan activity, but that relationship and connection is encouraged and is something you really should be doing. So I guess for that, I would love to, and I think you both have started speaking to this. I'm curious, just for those nonprofits where this is very new in thinking about ways they can engage, what do you feel like are some of those initial ways for organizations that have never reached out or not even really sure where to start? Is calling the staff in your offices, sending an email with sort of an initial, hey, here are the constituent groups we're working with would love to share a little bit more about our work. What would you say from a very kind of initial and introductory level would you recommend for nonprofits right now that are totally new to this?
I can jump in with some thoughts. I think the very first thing I would do is scan to get a sense of who the legislators are that you should prioritize. And I would prioritize based on whatever your issue area is. One issue I haven't talked about much, but is a major issue that needs a lot of services in our state, and I'm sure across the country, is around developmental disabilities. So let's say you're a nonprofit that is working, or just disabilities in general, that is working on disability issues. I would follow legislators who work on this issue. I would follow, and what I mean is social media. I mean signing up for their newsletters, just making sure that you know who they are. I would follow legislators that represent the district where most of your work is happening. If you're headquartered in a particular area or you may be spread out, find those legislators, start following them and just getting familiar with them. I would follow them on social media and sign up for their newsletters and just sort of do some background. I also think part of building a relationship is not only reaching out and having coffee and those sorts of things, or doing site visits, but showing up to their events and their activities. It means a lot and it says a lot for that nonprofit leader to show up to a town hall in my district that I'm hosting, or something virtual that I am attending, and even reaching out and saying, oh, I'm planning to be there, hope to get a chance to chat with you, and to say hello and not make any asks. Just I am with this organization. I just wanted to show up and be there, and that I'm seeing that person just engaged in the community. And then perhaps reaching out, and it can be just an email to our office. Would love to invite you to this event that we are hosting so you can see more of the work that we are doing. Try to keep it short in terms of time. We have so many pulls on our schedule, and at least in Maryland, we are a part-time legislature, so we have full-time jobs as well. So brief site visits to see the work and keeping it succinct, I think also will help to really ensure that the legislator is enlightened around the important work that you're doing.
So I swear I did not get hired by contract lobbyists to keep pitching that you should hire them. What I will say is this, though. I want everyone on the call to think about what it does to a legislature if it's either part-time or term limited or both. What it means is that you don't have full-time, many-year professionals who have their own institutional capital, their own staffs, who are the gatekeepers for knowledge and action in the Capitol. What happens is part-time legislatures and term-limited legislatures shift a lot of that responsibility over to a professional lobbyist corps. That's just the reality. And if I ever get in arguments with true dyed-in-the-wool libertarians, that's one of the things I like to say is, like, if you drown government in a bathtub, corporate lobbyists are just going to come right out of that bathtub stronger, right? And so somebody is going to be calling the shots. And so to the extent that your legislature is limited in this way, where legislators don't have a full attention span because they've got either other careers or they eventually have to move on and give up all their institutional knowledge to go elsewhere, think about what networks exist to exert influence within the Capitol. And so my advice is, if you don't hire one yourself, go talk to government relations teams at peer organizations, other nonprofits or other organizations doing similar work, or even just any sort of nonprofit cause that you have a good relationship with, and ask them kind of, what's your strategy? How do you approach legislative session? But I mean, it's totally viable to go reach out to individual legislators, and everything the delegate said about that is exactly right in my experience also. But what I would say is, you can also have a plan. You can talk to the people who do this for a living or engage the space with any sort of cause that might be comparable, and ask them, what are your strategies for a systematic approach to building relationships in the Capitol?
And Senator, I'm glad you said that. And it raises something for me too that we're seeing. So at Purpose Possible, a lot of the organizations we work with are small to mid-size. So the reality is there is not the budget and often not the staff capacity to do this individually. And so I think a big thing that we're seeing and encouraging on our side is really where it is possible to create a little bit more of a coalition among similar organizations, organizations that have a similar focus, be that in sector, in constituents served, whatever that may be. that is something that we're really encouraging as much as you can, like join forces with other nonprofits that are in your space. If you all don't individually have the capacity to hire someone to work on this for you, come together and do it. And I'm curious for you both, does that also does having a message, I know that you've said individual storytelling is important, but I'm curious, like, is having a strengthened message from, let's say, 5 to 10 nonprofits as opposed to a single nonprofit, does that have added punch, or is it equally effective for you all either way?
Well, I'll say this: anytime there's legislation that has coalitions for or against it, sometimes we get letters on our desks. I mean, quite often, in fact, there's at least 1 or 2 letters per day when we're passing bills from, it'll have the Georgia Chamber of Commerce or the Farm Bureau or justice coalitions like that. Exactly. So, there's definitely a visual element with those letters where you see 20 organizations have signed a letter. Then you realize, oh, it's the whole community of whatever XYZ has come out to say we're either for or against this. And so anytime you can visually represent, we came with a whole team. It's not just 1 or 2 people. It's not just 1 or 2 organizations, but truly everyone who is working on this issue has consensus around this. And then it's even more powerful if your coalition has ideological diversity. So it's one thing if your nonprofits are all working on the exact same issue in the exact same way. But like, for example, if you see a compromise between 2 organizations that sometimes work against each other, if they're on the same letter, then it's almost, a lot of legislators will just turn their brain off at that point. If they're like, hey, you guys are all cool with it and y'all are usually the ones fighting. So we're just going to move on this because it's uncontroversial, because we have limited attention spans and emotional energy ourselves. And we're not going to spend a whole lot more emotional energy on something if there's already kind of a workable compromise. So that's another kind of back to Laura's point about don't count any legislators out. Don't count any partner organizations out, right? There might be some sort of middle ground on an issue with an organization that might not be fully aligned with you. And if you can approach them and say, hey, what if we got the ball rolling on something we can both live with, whatever that might be, that optically creates that consensus that is created optically for the legislator really matters.
Yeah, there's always strength in coalition. Coalition building, I think, is so critical and so important. Actually, my full-time job at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights is the nation's oldest and largest coalition. And the organization came together. We're celebrating 75 years this year. And it is a coalition of over 200 organizations that share civil rights values, civil rights advocacy, and come together to be a more powerful voice around issues impacting all types of communities. And I see strong coalitions in Annapolis all of the time. And those really benefit from sharing resources, sharing relationships. I have seen coalitions that have a lobbyist. So they're lobbying on behalf of the issue or on behalf of the entire coalition. And on the issue of disabilities that I mentioned earlier, due to our fiscal challenges in the state, there was a major cut to our developmental disability administration funding. And when I tell you those groups came together and showed up and advocated as one voice to get those cuts restored to the budget, it was really powerful. It was really important. And lobby days, I don't think we've talked as much about lobby days yet, coming in and especially as a coalition, because some members may have folks on the ground who can come in and tell a story. Some groups may not. When you're working in coalition, you can all be represented and play different roles. And we had really big lobby days this legislative session from various nonprofits who were seeing cuts, various sectors that were seeing cuts, who came in and shared those stories and worked together to be one voice. And it was impactful.
For folks who might not be familiar, that just, again, like Susanna said, are really just starting to explore this type of engagement, can you say what a lobby day is? What does that mean?
Sure. Yeah. So lobby day is when a group or several groups come together and schedule meetings with legislators to talk about an issue or set of issues. So a lot of times in the beginning of session, groups will come in and say, these are our legislative priorities for session. Here's what we would like to see. For developmental disability organizations, they came in saying, we oppose these cuts. We need this funding. And a lot of times what's really powerful, they're meeting with us one-on-one and they're bringing in constituents. And I will say one of my secrets is my staff definitely asked, will constituents be there? And so if constituents are going to be there and they're coming in, I will make sure that I am there, even if I can only drop in to say hello because I'm in committee. And sometimes if it won't include any constituents, then my staff, my chief of staff might take it or someone else might take it. So bring in constituents to the Capitol or to your meetings with legislators, particularly if you're at the Capitol and doing a lobby day, is really powerful. But it's just an opportunity where you come in, set meetings. Usually you're meeting with several different legislators. So that's why it's kind of a day of lobbying. For nonprofits, you may just call it, legislator education days or something like that. And you're educating your members and bringing in people impacted to help really push the importance and help make sure the legislator truly is able to get an in-depth understanding on the issue.
That's great.
And you can make t-shirts. And the other thing is, well, because again, that's like an optics thing, right? You want the legislators to be able to visually identify your group and say, look how many of them are here. And the other thing that this doubles as in terms of benefit is once you sort of get educated yourself, if this is your first time figuring out how to do advocacy directly at the Capitol, you have the benefit of also introducing your members or the people who are volunteers, anybody who are your constituent community that is helping you deliver your services or make the impact you're making. You get to educate those people too. And so it's always a learning experience for advocacy days when individual volunteers or members, people in the community come out and there's a quick little primer on, hey, here's how you pass a note to whoever is going to tell a legislator to come out and meet you in the hallway. We have little ropes or little velvet ropes, I guess, so legislators feel safe, I guess. I don't know what it is, but protect you from the people, I guess. and so, you talk over that rope and usually there's like a flyer or something that somebody will hand you and say, here are the 2 or 3 bills we're concerned about. And thanks for your time. And it's like a 2-minute conversation. But that's a fun little civic exercise, and depending on the issue, maybe not as fun, but an exercise that any individual stakeholder can learn with you at the same time.
All right, Susanna, hearing all of this activity that our legislators would like to see in order to advocate better on behalf of nonprofits, knowing what we know, working with nonprofits and how stretched they are, how can nonprofits overcome some of those barriers?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think something that both Delegate Wilkins and Senator McLaurin both spoke to is have a bit of a plan and know who your officials are, know what, just in the same way we build out like a donor pipeline or for foundations we're going to talk to or anyone else that we're speaking to during the year. I think having a really clear plan to start with, to know who those individuals are, be that at the city or county level, at the state level, and really understand like what are the issues that are going to be important to them, and then make a stewardship plan for that the same way you would any other relationship that you're going to be stewarding throughout the year. I know I personally am this way, and I think it goes for a lot of our organizations. The best way to make sure you get it done during the year is to have the plan for it. So, and that also I think can just break it up a bit. And depending on the organization, I might even extend that to include beyond just some of those, thinking about who are those folks that are working in the mayor's office or the governor's office that may be really important contacts to have, who's on the school board, things like that, depending on what your sector is. And so from there, I think knowing what that plan is, then also really be intentional in understanding what are the programs, what are the issues that you need to be aware of. So I think one thing that a lot of the federal funding cuts has brought up is that it's also really important to understand where your money as an organization comes from. So yes, you may be seeing a cut at a federal level right now, but also what if you are an organization that relies on county or city or state funding, understanding what the trickle down effects of all of these cuts and and various policy decisions are going to look like and how that's going to impact your organization is going to make you much more informed when you're speaking to officials about that work and how you're anticipating impacts on your work and therefore on their constituents and the community you're serving are a couple of early pieces. And then I think too, this coalition building piece, I think a lot of the organizations we're working with, you know who your peers are in the sector. And I think to Senator McLaurin's point, who are the folks that maybe you're not always entirely on the same page with, but are still moving towards that same end goal? Where are those opportunities to come together and build collective voice to also help create some efficiencies and capacity around that outreach as well are some initial things that come to mind. And one of the good things is, as Purpose Possible is thinking about this, we are really thinking about this piece of government relations very much as, we often talk about fundraising, we talk about communications, but how government relations needs to be a really important third sort of piece of your overall annual planning and structure. It is, I think now more than ever, as we think about it, it really has to be part of the way that you're thinking about your annual activities and the way that you're planning organizationally to be able to tackle these things. And so this is something, if anyone has any questions afterwards, we'd love to talk to you about it. But this will be something that we are going to be able to support with and help our nonprofits that we're working with think about some capacity building around this type of muscle that I think we really want to see the sector develop a good bit, certainly over the next 3 years, but also, and the next 265 days of this year, but also just going forward. I think let's not let a crisis go to waste and recognize that this is a good opportunity to prepare your organization on a long-term basis for being prepared to have a much more robust relationship with our elected officials to help strengthen the sector overall.
All right, let's see if we have any questions from our viewers. So reminder, folks, if you have any questions, you can drop your questions in the comments on any of the streaming platforms. So while there's a little bit of a delay sometimes. So while we're waiting for questions to come in, I would love to hear, just sort of end on a positive note, from each of you, what is one piece of encouraging advice or a key takeaway that you would like to leave nonprofit leaders with as they navigate, the next 100 days and beyond?
Sure. So my strategy for hope in these times is sort of a cynical one, but that's how you know it's reliable. It's to kind of embrace the darkness and go all the way through to the hope that's on the other side of in the dawn, right? And so no doubt that all kinds of norms, institutions, programs are being destroyed right now. I mean, let's not mince words. And so what's going to happen, in my opinion, is that the American public is going to be forced to find stories, narratives to justify the things that, maybe our grandparents took for granted. And now we are having to recreate the narrative to justify why we do a lot of the things that the organizations, the Purpose Possible serves, do. And so even though I think it probably feels super daunting and overwhelming for a lot of nonprofit principals who think this is the worst it could possibly be, I think there's also a level playing field that's created where every single entity in American government at every level is having to learn this skill at the exact same time right now, which is, how are you going to tell your story? How are you going to grab attention in this media environment? How are you going to generate empathy and make people care about your issue? And so, again, darkness that breeds a little hope. If it's any consolation, I don't know that the nonprofit sector is in some ways, before what's happening at the federal government level, nonprofits were a little bit in the back seat, right, in terms of direct government spending. I think that there is a fresh opportunity now for leadership by everybody, political candidates, government agencies, nonprofits, to learn this new type of competition in this environment. And so if you get a jump start on it and you learn how to tell stories and build these relationships effectively, I think you can be part of the solution in picking up the pieces from all of this.
All right. We do have a couple of questions that have come in. All right. From Rachel Ezzo, for the legislators, who do you see as sector leaders for nonprofits? I think there is a general need for nonprofit representation, not just by the sectors or the specific missions we represent, but nonprofits as, a business sector, an economic sector.
Do you have the text of that question? Let's see. Okay. Yeah, I see it now under comments. Okay.
So who do you recognize are as sector leaders for nonprofits? Like you mentioned, the Metro Atlanta Chamber of Commerce. Who are those entities that you recognize or know representing nonprofit sector as a whole?
I mean, I'm happy to name some names in Georgia, and I think it's telling. I mean, it's everything we're saying, it comes true in the answer I'm about to give you, which is these are the folks who come to the Capitol every day that I have relationships with and who do the work and get bills passed. So to me, you're a sector leader if you are doing the work and you are present, right? Georgia Justice Project every year gets 1 or 2 bills passed that dramatically improve the lives of justice impacted people. And it usually is a Republican who sponsors their legislation. So like they have got it worked out. Southern Poverty Law Center comes and does great advocacy. The People's Agenda. I mean, there's you could name all the names, but what you would be doing is basically going down your mental list of the people who you see most often, who are visible and who have bills moving. And so I want to give an answer that directly reinforces everything we've said today, which is this is not clout from like a revenue perspective. This is not like who are the most recognizable names just generally in the public. The people for me who I think are doing the work are there. They're present.
Got it. Oh, you're muted.
This question is really interesting for me because I think that I really do think of nonprofits more so in their sectors and by issue areas and by their missions as opposed to overall. So I have to think about that a little bit more. But similar to the senator, the ones that come to mind are in 2 categories. One is the folks that are in Annapolis day in, day out. One of them is Casa de Maryland. They work on immigrant rights issues. I worked with them this legislative session to pass a bill that I sponsored dealing with sensitive locations and ensuring that in Maryland, we have very clear guidelines on how we limit our participation when it comes to immigration enforcement. And they are just extremely visible in Annapolis, but also in our neighborhoods and our communities, working with immigrant communities throughout the state. So CASA definitely comes to mind. The Renters United Coalition, which is several organizations. I work a lot on eviction prevention legislation and do a lot of work on those issues. And again, very visible, very strategic, meeting with members, using a coalition model. And so they come to mind. But then back home in my district, there are groups that are changing the lives of my residents and impacting the lives of my residents and spend time in Annapolis, but may not be the day in, day out advocates that I see every day. And so organizations like Manna Food Center and organizations like our local Y that's under new leadership, who's been doing an amazing job working to engage us and serving the residents in my community. So those are some of the ones that come to mind, and it's based on both physically seeing them and physically seeing their impact as well.
Great. We've got another question, but this one is very specific to an issue here in Georgia. So, Adi, I'm going to ask you to drop that one off. And we're going to wrap up here. We're right at 1:00. So let's give Susanna and Delegate Wilkins just a moment to give us their one piece of encouraging advice or key takeaway for the next 100 days for nonprofit leaders.
I think my piece of advice and my sunshine moment is that we should start from a place that we have a shared value around wanting to improve the lives of our constituents. And the nonprofit community is working directly with our residents in various ways to improve and impact their lives. And that's the same thing that we're working to do legislatively. So when we start from that point and figure out how we can work together, how we can build a relationship, how we can make sure that our nonprofits are properly funded to do that work, I think that puts us at a really great starting point.
So I think one of the things that I kind of we've said, and I know we're at time, but somatically, this feels very similar to COVID and when we were at the outset of the pandemic. And I think similarly to in that moment, just remembering that this is, we have been in recent times, been through really difficult kind of periods like this as well. And I think that collective action and advocacy was a really good tactic then. And I think just remembering that we have the recent experience to know what to do a little bit. And so just lean on that, know that I think we all, at least on this call, feeling that sort of rising tides is going to raise all ships sort of mentality here. So as much as we can sort of de-silo ourselves and think about how we can be engaging with the folks that are going to help sort of get through this moment in this administration.
Thank you all so much for being here. Just a reminder that anyone that registered for the webinar will receive a direct email with notes and the recording. And registration is available at purposepossible.com/blog, which should be dropping into the chat in whatever platform you're streaming. Senator, Delegate, we really appreciate your time. We know that you are very busy people, as evidence of your bios that I read at the beginning. And Susanna, thanks as always. Appreciate it, everybody. Have a good one.